Hey, how's it going, everyone? My name is Garrett, and I'm your host for this podcast series, Converging Careers Interprofessional Practice for Speech Therapy. And right now, we're both in Los Angeles. Just shout outs to everyone living here. Our hearts go out to everyone who might be affected by the fire. It's a little smoky over here, but I think we're both doing okay. Just a little extra background on the series. This is a series about having the chance to explore ideas from other fields and insights from other fields that might overlap with speech therapy and perhaps inform our practice as therapists. And I think today is super relevant and important because we're talking about the field of communication science, which is very close to communication disorders. And so I'm super excited to talk with Constance Bainbridge, who is a fifth year PhD student and researcher at UCLA. And she's interested in expressivity with an emphasis on intrapersonal communication, which we'll talk about. It's super cool. So kind of how do we as individuals communicate with ourselves? She's also the principal investigator for the Stream of Mind Lab, a cross-institution collaborative research group, and she incorporates ideas from evolutionary, developmental, and cognitive research in an effort to understand what influences and characterizes the flow of streams of consciousness. So what behaviors make up a constellation of self-communicative abilities and how interventions can be designed to improve our self-directed experience of life. Constance has also studied music, both as a performer and from a research standpoint, exploring questions such as how human song with different musical features plays a role in parent-infant interactions. So before we get started, just a couple of items. This course is 1 hour and is offered for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. If you're joining us for the live course and your state license requires the live CEUs, be sure to complete all the modules, including the one that says quiz before the end of the day on your speechtherapypd.com account. The questions can be written in I think there's a Q&A box, and we will address them as we go along. And as far as financial disclosures, we both receive an honorarium from speechtherapypd.com for this podcast. And so without further ado, Connie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm super excited to talk to you. I always ask the guests just a little bit about their origin story, kind of before we get into the meat of the conversation. So what got you interested in this field and with the interpersonal communication specifically?
Yeah, I would say it was a really windy road, but it all started with an existential crisis as a small child, realizing, why am I me? Why am I not everyone? Why can't I be everyone? So I've always been really interested in the creative power we have over our experiences. That kind of got funneled into music for a long time as a performer, and I did my undergraduate degree in classical violin. But I always felt like there was a bigger world that I was curious about the creation of. Music is awesome, but it's one modality, and I find multimodal creation really interesting as well. Um, After I finished my degree, I was sort of hopping in and out of academia, getting a taste for research and really enjoying the process of using a lot of really different kinds of skills to ask any kind of question and actually tackle it or hope to tackle it. So that started with looking at perception and memorability of visuals, so scenes and objects, but I was also working on an auditory illusion at the time. And then I pivoted to this more evolutionary and developmental perspective, specifically looking at music. So, like you mentioned, my main project was looking at human song and whether there might be an actual adaptive reason for having certain features based on the fact that, from what we can tell, mothers and parents and caregivers all over the world sing, especially lullabies, to their infants and to the infants in their communities. So this project was looking at actually the physiological response of babies to music from all over the world. And this was comparing lullabies as well as songs that were not meant for infant soothing studies would be things like dance songs from different cultures or love songs. And even not knowing the language, not knowing the culture at all, these babies were relaxing more for those lullabies. So this could be sort of hinting at the power of acoustic features over our emotions, over our sense of safety. And it's just really interesting to think of music as something that might be more than just, as Steven Pinker likes to say, auditory cheesecake, sort of just something that touches on those feel good senses but has no purpose. Um,
Right.
but yeah, after that, I went into the communication department at UCLA through one of our collaborators. And at that stage, I was trying to figure out, okay, so my background is very like evolutionary psychology, developmental psychology, cognitive science. What does it mean to now study communication? And trying to find where I wanted to fit into that world. And so I was thinking about creativity, imagination. Why do we create fiction? And then landed on this. Well, even ignoring the stories we write, every day we're sort of curating the story of our own life. And I landed on this concept, intrapersonal communication from there.
That's awesome. So cool. I feel like I always get along with the musicians because we have such a interesting
Mhm.
background that weaves in and out of different places. But maybe, and there's so many things I want to touch on just in that, but maybe we'll get to the more of the music stuff later.
Mhm.
Can you just give us a quick definition of intrapersonal communication?
Sure. So, at least the way I view it, intrapersonal communication is using communication like tools or devices or behaviors to communicate with yourself. The goal being to somehow influence yourself or understand yourself.
Got it. So it is not just, but it includes, but is not limited to the inner voice that people often report hearing.
Yeah, and the concept of interpersonal communication has actually faced a lot of pushback and criticism for this open-endedness, because certainly the majority of people, at least in the kind of industrialized world, can relate to ideas like self-talk and using language in your mind to literally say, Connie, don't forget to pack your lunch or stuff like that. But intrapersonal communication tries to allow for any kind of communication. So I use body language a lot. Maybe you use body language to communicate something to yourself as well. Or when you're imagining a rich visual landscape, how is that not also, in a way, painting a portrait for yourself or painting a scenery? And I want to maintain this sort of whatever we can use to influence ourselves is changing information for ourselves. And that's what communication does.
Could this be something like, so interoception, your, autonomic processes, like, your breathing, for example, you can notice it and then modulate your breathing pattern to influence how you're feeling. Is that related?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's related. And if anyone's curious about the debate on the existence of intrapersonal communication, there's a paper by this guy Cunningham from 1992. And one of the criticisms he brings up is, so what does that mean? Pain is self directed communication? But I think it is, because pain is your body telling you you need to do something. I am giving you direction, I'm giving you new information to cause action. But as you're sort of alluding to, there might be sort of levels of how you can use communication to control aspects of yourself. So maybe the pain is sort of something that just arises naturally, but then you're aware of it, and that awareness changes things, because you can think like, what if I think about something that feels good in my body? And that's sort of mindfulness meditation.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to clarify for everyone listening, this is in contrast to interpersonal communication, right?
Yeah.
Where you're talking, that's typically what we think of as communication, especially as a speech therapist. We're talking usually about how do we, send a signal to somebody else. So
Mhm.
between people. But this is kind of that process within in yourself. So intrapersonal,
Mhm.
and that's so interesting because we can even, extend. I wonder if we can extend, speech therapy techniques, for example, how we think about talking to other people, for example, in social pragmatic therapy, where we try to think about their perspective, be nice to them. We can use some of those same techniques in modulating our own self-talk, which could become a barrier to, I don't know, happiness and thriving.
Mhm, absolutely. And there is actually work suggesting that imagining an interaction with someone sometimes can actually replace your need to have that interaction. So instead of confronting someone, sometimes imagining that confrontation might alleviate some of the stress you feel over that, whether it was like they offended you over something. So already some people are seeing that that might be the case.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think there's so many uses for intrapersonal communication in social pragmatic therapy that we might do in speech. Um, I wanted to ask if there's a difference, in what is the difference between the inner voice and the external voice, let's say. So when we're talking, are there differences um, in how it, I don't know, sounds, for example, or what kind of language it uses?
That's a very good question. In some regards, that's a very much open question. So it's really hard to study in its purest form what's happening in the mind. So even if you have someone write down their thoughts, you're already constraining it. So for myself, I do experience what feels like competing thoughts that can kind of coexist. But as soon as you're having like a conversation with someone, as soon as it's tangible in the outside world, you kind of are going to follow that path. Or if you jump around, it's not that it's happening at the same time. Like you're on topic one, and then you're on topic two, and then maybe you return to topic one. So that's one thing that I think could be a difference. Another thing that I like to think about a lot is how when we are communicating with each other, you're not the only person that's hearing what I say. I'm hearing what I say too. I'm also part of the audience, and how I think what I say is reflecting what I believe, what I know, who I am, is gonna probably feed back into what I say next, as well as whether you nod, whether you look bored, um, and so I'd be interested in seeing down the line, how much do people vary in how they're talking through someone else to themselves versus
Mm,
actually like a fully dyadic interaction. So I'm talking and I'm fully listening to you versus like, you are my sounding board for ideas. That's a phrase
mhm,
people say. So
mm.
yeah.
Oh man, that's so interesting. Yeah, as you were talking, I had a couple of ideas popped up. One being, how being in conversation with somebody else can sort of impose a structure, whether you want to or not. That you have to kind of follow this particular thread of topics, and that's something that we work on in a lot of social therapy, group therapy, is that, like, how do you stay on topic versus just whatever pops in your head? Don't just say that there, but stay on that train and think about the other person. And I wonder if something you also mentioned writing things down as a way to, some type of way to measure that inner voice. And what I've seen in some of the research and then in anecdotally, I found that when I write something down, it is like introducing a communication partner because it imposes a structure on my thoughts, which, I don't always recognize throughout the day, but that they're kind of running in the background and they can jump from here to there really, really quickly, and probably way more uh, than I imagine or think. And then they kind of become like this chaos, this chaotic storm, and then they can tumble out of control. But like writing it down kind of imposes some structure that I guess might allow me to release it. I don't know. How do you see? Do you have any research to that speaks to that, or thoughts about
Um, yeah. So Right now, I'm conducting a study to compare what happens if you're talking out loud with speech to yourself versus typing. And I haven't been able to analyze my data yet because I'm still in the collection phase, but there is some work on just sort of what happens with speaking, what happens with typing. And one of the things that's pretty different is with typing or writing, handwriting, you have the opportunity to stop and think endlessly. You can edit it. It's not really constrained in the temporal way, but it feels like it needs to be sort of a complete thought often. While when you're speaking, once that word's out there, it's out there. And it makes sense to kind of keep a flow going. So, for example, there's this paper I read where they had people writing down their dreams, they were either writing them down or they were recording an audio like dream journal essentially. And when they were speaking it, the dream recall was very like hugely abstract, jumping around, super disjointed, but the written down dreams were less so. So even with something like dreams that are crazy and wild, they might be affected by how you're trying to even remember them or write them down. So it makes sense to me that if you're writing like a biography for your LinkedIn or something, if you're typing it versus speaking, you might be presenting yourself hugely differently.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if that's something that would, I think that writing could be a pretty great tool for some of the kiddos that I'm thinking of in my social
Mhm.
groups. So I guess this is also related to what you see as both, I guess, the functions of and the benefits of intrapersonal communication. So maybe first we can talk about, what do you think its function is? Why do you think we have this? I mean, that's a deep
Mm,
question, but have you
yeah.
solved the mysteries of
I mean, it's gonna vary also in how you use it. I think it's a very adaptable tool. There is one theory that, like, so there's this idea of mental foraging. So as you're thinking of what to write or what to say, you have to adventure through the woods of your mind and choose words and choose topics. And then from there, you have to go from somewhere that makes sense from where you've ended up. And it's kind of similar to if you were foraging for berries in the wild. So there, Peter Todd is one of the people that has this idea that literally the physical foraging of the world and the mental foraging that we do might have sort of evolutionary links where it's helpful to have some kind of mental image of what is and isn't in the world that you can imagine going around in so that you can navigate the world better. And so I like to take that idea less of the like, okay, in my mind, I remember where the berries are, and more of the, my mind gives me a tool to experiment before I go into the world and make mistakes or don't know what I'm doing. Like, if I haven't first explored, I could go to the kitchen and get a snack, I could go to bed, I could take a shower. You can do all those things by imagining, by thinking before you actually have to do them. So I think it's one way of streamlining the efficiency of our decision making. Um,
Mhm.
that's the most obvious, like adaptive thing. If you think from just the basic evolutionary ultimate question of how do you keep yourself alive and pass on your genes and stuff. But some of the maybe functions that are more co-opted from this original origin might be
Mhm.
things like you can better understand what your needs are, for example. So, with rumination, one of the problems is that you're locked into thinking the same thought over and over again. If you're able to take a step back, you might see that there's a bigger picture happening inside you. But if you're only in this patch of your mind, all of this is left in the dark. All those berries are left behind. So yeah, I don't know. There's so much that it can do.
Yeah.
And
I
just one last thing to throw out there. I think it's also super important for the idea of consciousness. Um, we can get into that later if we have
That's just a quick one. We can solve that
we can solve
easily.
all of this.
Yeah. That's awesome. I love that idea of forging. That's so cool. It reminds me of Anne, who we had on the podcast as well. Her
Mhm,
idea of infant vocalizations as being a type of foraging, um,
mhm,
and it's one thing that's I think overlooked is the because as speech therapists we tend to think of um, motivations as being requesting things, rejecting things. So like we talk about communication functions. So the function of an utterance might be to say I want that or I don't want that. But we don't think a lot about these innate drives for exploring and curiosity and just doing
mhm,
things out of sort of a sense of I don't know if this makes sense as a kid, but like awe and wonder almost. Like you're just curious about doing that thing. And I think those things are overlooked in speech therapy and, especially in something like behaviorism, which would
mm.
like totally sort of uh, dispense with this notion of the inner voice entirely, just to say like let's only look at the mechanistic explanation for this. Um, so just sorry, we had one quick question from Araz.
Mhm.
She just asked, so is verbal speech more genuine than written speech? And
Mm.
I don't know, maybe you can pick this up, but yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
I think it's possible that to some degree that's still an open question for research. Um, I guess some of it's gonna depend on with writing, so in my studies, I tell people to write in a stream of consciousness, hoping that they're not stopping to think about it before they type, but how successful people are at that is unclear. And then on the flip side, we all know those people that everything they say seems rehearsed. And certainly some people, it's their job to be able to know what they're going to say pretty quickly while still being sort of constrained in what you say. So it might be an individual difference situation there, but it will be harder, I think, to conceal your true intentions with speech just even because there's also the added aspect of there being the voice. So language communicates one thing, but then the prosody in the voice is communicating another thing. So there's kind of more to control.
Yeah, yeah. This is like, unfortunately, like most of the time I get a question, the answer is usually it's complicated,
Come study it
especially
with us.
yeah, yeah, and you know, like the idea of what is genuine is also confusing one because you have a lot
Mm,
of competing, um, I don't know, kind of different personalities inside you already that are all trying to act out different things, and you sort of might. I'm thinking about maybe something like if you're just talking through something, you might. I can't think of a great example of this, but that you could think of a conflict right between your personalities where maybe you want to eat that cake and it's New Year's Eve or sorry it's New Year's and you're like I'm just resolving to be healthy and I don't want to eat the cake and because I this genuine part of me wants to be healthier and you eating the cake maybe part of you wants that but then this who's to say what is more genuine the part that is trying to constrain that
mm,
behavior or the part that wants the cake right and so I think in the same way, when you're speaking and then you're writing, I think the writing is often this like higher level, sort of well thought out. This New Year's you that's saying like, "Hey, I'm sculpting this idea, this story, this narrative of my thought that came out in a particular way that I want to direct it to." So, in that sense, it can sometimes be more genuinely you, although it's complicated.
yeah, I
um,
love this topic because my little research lab, the Stream of Mind lab, we meet and debate this all the time because, like you, I think of the self that's trying to like hold back my instincts, my desires. That's my true self. Like the me that I want to be has it under control. But then one of my colleagues says, "No, no, that's the me that I'm trying to stop. The controlling me is not the real me. The real me is my raw desire for that cake."
yeah, yeah. So I guess confusing. We have a couple more that we
Hmm.
can get to in just a little bit. Chaitra and Helen. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. But I did want to just pick up on Helen's comment really quick because it was something I forgot to ask you about. She's saying that she's one of the people that does not have an inner voice and does not visualize. So this is when I
Oh.
went to your lecture, Connie, you talked about endophagia and unendophagia, and maybe we can just bring this up. It'd be cool to hear if anyone else in the audience does not have the inner voice, but maybe can you define what those terms are and maybe talk a little bit about hidden differences?
Sure. Yeah. So endophagia is the inner speech. So the idea is that there's something speech like, but it's not vocalized. So no one around you would be able to hear it except inside your mind you quote hear it. And a lot of people have this sort of dogma that that is normal. That's what everyone has. I know plenty of people who believe that anyone who doesn't have it just doesn't realize that they have it, which I don't agree with. But to not have that inner voice is called anendophagia. And this term, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't really coined until maybe last year. So there's work by Niedergard and Lupien, I believe. Gary Lupien does a lot of interesting work in this area. And they've shown that there are differences in how you do different tasks based on whether or not you have an inner voice. Um, and then with the visualization side, to not have an ability to visualize imagery in your mind is called aphantasia. And there are scales that try to get at this as if it's sort of there are levels to it, where an aphantasic, there's a concept, like I know I have the concept of an apple, but there's no specific apple that's showing up in my mind. There's no color unless you ask me to decide a color, and the concept of the color I can, I guess, then pull up. And then there's actually, I believe it's called hyperphantasia, where it's basically like you're hallucinating an apple. And there's someone in my lab group who does research on awe, and I think Garrett, you might have seen, you might have met him. His name's Eli, but he's a hyperphantasic, and so he says he can see an apple on the table if you ask him to see that apple. Um, but as far as hidden differences go, so that's the idea that a lot of these things, like what does it look like in our minds, are not factored in when we do studies. And these could be studies like how are you at memorizing faces? Like if I show you a bunch of faces, can you press a button successfully when it's a repeat of the same face you saw a while ago? There's so many studies that they do something like that, claim that they've found the ground truths of things like humans have XYZ kinds of biases. More attractive people are more memorable or not more memorable. These kinds of things people assume. But if you can't even visualize the face, how does that impact the memory? And there are so many different things that make our experience as individuals just vastly different. And so the idea of these hidden differences is why not try to better understand these? What is it that we are missing? If you, for example, don't have visualization and don't have an endophagia, so the inner speech, what other tools in real life are best for you? Do you prefer to touch things as a way of understanding how they work? Yeah, all these things are just kind of not understood right now.
Yeah, yeah. It does make me think about how therapists like us as SLPs have to deal with like learning differences and um, you know just understanding this whole other level, this hidden level of difference in what might be going on, especially since we, you know, especially in peds, you deal with a lot of kids that don't have language yet.
Mhm.
What's going on in that inner voice is that's kind of a mystery. And there's a lot of people talking in the chat, Helen and Chaitra, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, about, contrasting, oh, I have like a just really hyper inner voice that's talking all the time. I can definitely relate
Me
to
too.
that. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you were mentioning before this talk that there is, you know, sometimes you can see this in writing that actually the language that you use with yourself can sometimes help to screen for things like depression and anxiety. Like you mentioned, excessive use of pronouns, for example, like I, me, my, might lead
Mhm.
to that. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, so I think especially a lot of work's been done in looking at what our language can reveal about ourselves. It's also sort of an area of if we change that language, what happens to you? But for example, as you were mentioning, so people who ruminate a lot, they tend to get very tethered in these first person personal pronouns, I, me, my. And there's also this idea of sort of psychological distance. So there can be many different measurements of psychological distance, like how far away physically something is, how far away in time, how distant in concept something seems. So, like an apple and a pear might feel closer together than an apple and a car. And these things actually get reflected in language as well. So, when you're ruminating, you're likely also getting really, really psychologically close to yourself. And so that could be reflected again with those pronouns. There are other language features you could look at, like how much your topic varies or not. So that's something that I'm starting to do more research into is how to measure change over time in your language and seeing whether that can be predictive of rumination. Um, but on the flip side, if you're too psychologically distanced from yourself, which might show up in a lot of really abstract language, you're not sort of tethered to anything, that might represent other things, maybe depression. I wouldn't be surprised if it could reflect things like depersonalization or derealization. Um, so, yeah, it's still very much an interesting area to explore, and it's something that the large language model world is starting to get into as well. Because there are some things that might be obvious, like if you're using a lot of negative sentiment or negative emotion in your language, that seems to suggest negative emotion in yourself, but there could be deeper patterns as well that only an algorithm could find.
Yeah, yeah, true. There's definitely a lot of ground that we can start to cover now with these new tools. I wanted to just backtrack a little bit. Um, I was listening to I don't know if you know Dr. Ethan Cross um, uh, on just a podcast just in preparation because I wanted to know a little bit more about like the inner voice stuff. And he
Mhm,
talked about a few more functions of the inner voice. And I'm wondering if you can maybe comment on these a little bit more. But I think these are really related to speech therapy. So things like your ability to plan and do mental time travel is one function of perhaps function of the inner voice. Obviously, like the phonological loop, so your verbal working memory, something like you hear yourself rehearsing your grocery list or something like that, or I don't know, not phone numbers anymore. No one needs those, but yeah, something like that. Um,
mhm,
and then also, I thought this idea was really important that that self control is actually practiced through self talk, um,
mhm,
and and I think there's another thing. I often when I'm trying to get up a little earlier in the new year, and that I've done this little trick of doing like a countdown, like a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then all right, I'm up. Like I never want to get up, but that inner voice seems to be helpful to get you to do hard things. And I
yeah,
imagine that without language, without the language ability, all of those sort of benefits sort of go out the window. And it maybe it just speaks to the importance of learning language. I'm not sure. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts. I'll throw my shorter thought in first. I agree language empowers us in a really unique way. I do think there are non-linguistic ways we do stuff similar. So one other thing I'm interested in is how our self communication can also involve things outside of the self, which might sound confusing because I'm saying it's within the self. But if I put my water bottle next to the door, I'm communicating the importance of remembering it. So there could be things like that that we could debate whether or not that's
Mm.
intrapersonal communication. And then on the language and performance front, so of the fields that are studying things like self-talk the most, one of the biggest areas is sports psychology, and they've done a lot
Mm.
of really interesting work there. Um, I believe the name's James Hardy. He's done a lot in this area, and one of the things they've found is motivational self-talk versus instructional self-talk have different benefits. So with
Mm.
instructional self-talk, it can fine-tune precision a little bit. So that'll be things like, okay, first, if you're doing like archery or something, I'm gonna hold up the bow this way and I'm gonna make sure I line up the things with my ear or whatever. I'm not an archer. I'm sorry if that's wrong. Um, Meanwhile, motivational self talk can boost endurance. So if you're doing like a really long bike ride, then being like, you can do it, you're almost there, you just got to keep pushing through, you'll see gains in endurance. So certainly
Interesting.
the language specifically gives us more directed ways to communicate to ourselves about specific things we want to work on.
Would you have any tips or advice for, let's say, I have a couple of clients that I'm working with who they're in, social group therapy, but their self-talk, I guess, is externalized, but I can hear it basically every time something gets hard. It's like, I'm terrible at this. I can never get it right.
Mm.
I give up. It's hard. I give up. And we've tried so much of uh, kind of the grit motivation. Like we're trying to help reprogram those thoughts or replace them, but it just like nothing really seems to stick. I'm wondering if you have
Mm.
any thoughts on that. Maybe number one, how that was became a pattern and how to work through that.
Yeah, I think that to me sounds like a time when the psychological distance concept could be helpful. So
Mm.
I would imagine, what if, like maybe I would say to one of them, what if you take those words you're saying right now and imagine that they're being spoken by someone else? Like maybe you can use yourself as an example. And you're watching this person say it, like put them in a bystander position where if you were just watching this go down, what would you think? What would you want to say to that person? And that's something I hear people say sometimes, like, would you speak that way about a friend or to a friend? And
Mhm.
certainly, if you had a friend who was saying, like, I give up, I suck at everything, the instinct is to be like, no, why do you think that? So I think giving them the space away from themselves, but it's easier said than done. And something else I think about a lot is how a lot of therapies can be hard because they sound easy. It's like, "Oh, well, yeah, I could just try to be optimistic," but, like, that's so cheesy. I'm not someone who can look in the mirror and say, "You're wonderful, you're gonna achieve things today." I'm not good at the affirmations thing. So in cases like that, it might be "How about you write down what you're saying instead of saying it for a moment here, and then read it back?" Yeah, so just finding different ways to externalize it and make it separate from themselves so that they're not identifying as the words I say are me. These are my definitions.
I love that. Yeah, psychological distancing
Mhm.
is such a great term. The first time I'm hearing it. Um, this is a little bit back to a previous point, but we had talked about just before this call. We were just chatting, and we were talking about how this voice is formed, and the developmental psychologist Vygotsky, who maybe SLPs know from the kind of they teach about the zone of proximal development, which is kind of like how you want to teach kids right in their level of where they just can't quite do it yet, but it's challenging enough that they can get it with a little practice. So you want to be in that zone for optimal development. So basically, Vygotsky's idea was that kids, when they're really young, they hear their parents tell them a bunch of stuff, like don't don't eat your dessert before your dinner, or whatever it is. Don't stand on the table. And then you hear the kids talking, and they're saying these things out loud as like kind of practicing. And this practice is like practicing the parent's perspective on their perspective, and that both kind of becomes the inner voice, or in his ideas or theory, one of the things that becomes the inner voice, and one of the things that helps develop skills of perspective taking and self-control. Um, and this is something that I think is sort of maybe overlooked in speech therapy, but seems like one of the big barriers to even doing therapy is self-regulation and the ability to take perspectives, things like that. What do you think about that? Where do you think that in development the inner voice is created?
Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one because I think there's some version of something like inner voice, possibly from the very start. Obviously, that's not the
Mm,
language component. And then there is this sort of boom in overt private speech, so talking out loud, but to yourself around age 3, I believe, until maybe 5 or 7, and that usually lines up with some self-regulation abilities getting enforced. Um, and it's interesting to think about, like, what is beneficial to that period of time when us as bystanders can hear their inner thoughts, and then what happens once that moves inside, because then it's harder to have access to it without some kind of filtering and whatnot. Um, and it's tricky because there's not a lot of research really looking at how our self-talk as adults is shaped by the things that we see our parents say to us or to themselves when we're developing an understanding of language. So that's actually an area that needs more work. Because certainly I've also seen that, like, I have these twin nieces who are 2 years old, and they'll hit each other, they'll be told, "Be gentle," and then they're like, "Gentle," very, like, they're proud to know that fact. Um, but I think in general that, like, the curiosity that an infant and a young child has is sort of, to me, already the intrapersonal communication being there, because that
mm,
curiosity drives, like, I want information, and then they see something, and then they're like, "How do I understand this information?" Um, so I don't know if I'm necessarily answering your question, but I think it's a hugely rich space where that language is gonna be a factor, but even just understanding how they experience creatively everything that is happening,
yeah.
language or not, that might all have some role in their concept building and yeah.
Well, I think that's a really important point that us as SLPs kind of miss sometimes. The point being that there is this drive to learn and forage, and explore, and just like a sort of natural curiosity, because I think we tend to focus on how do you, sort of in this like behaviorist way, how do you um, uh, what is the word? How do you reinforce this communication? I remember I was talking to Anne just not too long ago, and she was telling me something about how, um, or I was trying to describe how an SLP deals with like uh, an infant vocalizing, starting to vocalize, or you hear early words, and every time the infant is vocalizing, you give them a lot of praise. Yay, you said something amazing, yes. And she's like, honestly, I think that sometimes it gets in the way. It interferes with these natural processes. And I think she was speaking sort of anecdotally from her own child, but I can see that being the case because there's other research that suggests that basically when you have something that the child, or, this is for older kids, but if they're interested in music, for example, and you say, oh, music, that's good for them, and you start to give them candy every time they play music, they stop playing music without the candy. Basically,
Mm.
they begin to associate it with that reward, and then it actually undermines their desire to do that thing. And so there is this like underlying curiosity and drive that we forget that is quite strong, that can carry kids, when it's working properly to the
That just
the
made me
next
think
phase.
of a study that I find so adorable and hilarious. So this study was observing that infants, when they were alone, were vocalizing more in a certain degree than when their
Mm,
caregiver was there. And one obvious thing could be, well, maybe they're trying to get the caregiver to come there. But the study also had a version where anytime the infant vocalized, it was amplified so that it got louder. And when that happened, they vocalized for longer duration. So they were like really curious about their own voice. And I think a lot of the sounds babies are making, like, it's not about the people in the room. It's, I have this ability. And I think I've heard people talk about even like the vibration of making vocalizations can be kind of fun and satisfying, and it makes you want to do it more. I
yeah,
mean, why else do we do the like kind of stuff? Like, that's not going to
right.
help them that much, maybe, to learn English, but it sure is fun. And they do laugh a lot when you do it and when they get to try it. So, yeah.
Right, right. There's a theory of, I mean, there's so many competing theories about autism, but one of them is about the sort of inability to uh, collapse different sensory uh, things, stimuli together. So, like when you're vocalizing, when an autistic child is vocalizing, for example, it's hard for them to know that a sound coming from the mouth is theirs and coming from them, and the timing aspect is kind of disconnected, and so one thought that I had at some point, like a maybe a fun thing to try out, would be like if you had some device that vibrated whenever you vocalized. I wonder if that would be a helpful, like, sort of a
Mm,
cue. Um, but yeah, yeah, and Helen's mentioning that, yeah, it's like the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, totally. Um,
mhm,
and there's a couple of more comments that, working with under 3-year-olds, and most of the families talk about how their kids do so much vocal play first thing in the morning and before going to bed. That's interesting.
uh-huh.
And yeah, it's totally good to explore and practice those things. Um, yeah. And I think where speech therapists do come in, and where we make a lot of, I think, progress and change for kids, is when some of those things are breaking down and you don't see any vocalizations, no exploratory, uh, utterances. And so in those cases, I think you do need to switch to thinking about, okay, what are the things that the child wants, and then how can you associate getting those things with symbolic communication, like verbal communication. Um, yeah, yeah. Maybe so. We have about 10 minutes left, and
Mhm.
I wanted to talk about this more, but this is just so interesting. The inner voice is so cool. But I wonder if we could talk just a little bit about, you're mentioning like infant directed speech, and how infants, like, kind of intrinsically, innately have this really strong emotional response to speech and lullabies and music.
Mhm.
Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, so the theory behind why this infant directedness might be so interesting is that it could be an honest signal of, hi, I am here and I can take care of you. So the idea here being that, first of all, it's tailored for infants in the sense that they're not talking to another adult about something irrelevant to the child. If you're in danger, you're not going to be singing soothingly to a child. Um, and so it's maybe even possible that to some degree melody might have come out of this, because it's like lullabies and infant directed song tends to be repetitive, but it does have this nice like melody to it. It's not going to be like da 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 da. That would be better for dance music. Um, and so it's got like the right balance of having something interesting happening. So it shows like, hi, I am here and I am here for you. Um, I at least hear the Siri propose a lot for music, and the person I would suggest looking into for research on this is Samuel Mayer, who I used to work in the lab with, and my study was babies listening to lullabies was out of his lab. And yeah, he has this great paper in behavioral and brain sciences that sort of tries to propose that rhythm evolved for coordinate, like for dance, and to sort of be able to coordinate successfully, or like, yeah, while the lullabies have more maybe of that melodic side where it's showing, like I said, this honest signal. Because there's so many series that people try to propose about, like, why do we make music, and so to tie it to something so specific, I think is really cool. Often people just say like, "Oh, music brings us together. Like, it makes us hang out." And it's like, but what does that mean? Why does it do that? Um, yeah, but I think it's really interesting how this thing that maybe would only be relevant in an early stage of someone's life, it does seem to stick around. We all seem to care about music to some degree, or at the very least, know what we don't like.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think every culture has, a version of language and music. And I was just talking to Dr. Bob Slevik from University of Maryland last week, or sorry, last podcast.
Mhm.
And I think his idea is mirrored in a lot of research now on language and music. But essentially, his idea is that basically the pre-symbolic mind of the infant, it hears music first. I mean, like so it's there's basically all there is organized sound in the world. And actually when you're born, your sound, you have this bias for sound, because you can't even see a face when you're born. Like your
Mhm.
eyesight, your vision doesn't develop till after you can hear stuff, but you can't see stuff very well. So your first impressions of people when you're a baby are all like sonic. So
Mhm.
that's another reason why maybe these signals of lullabies and of of a safe space are so important when you're young. But basically, you're hearing just the musical aspects of sound first. So like music and language completely overlap in the beginning, and you have to
Mhm.
parse out the different contexts in which they become important, and then once you are sort of able to do that, you can focus your attention to, in music, let's say, the relationship between pitches and rhythm, and then in language you focus on the semantics and the syntax, and like who did what to who, things like that become important.
Mhm. Yeah,
um,
this is something I find very interesting because I have to try to learn lyrics usually of songs, and one of my anecdotal series is that because I grew up playing violin, I hear melody more eagerly in music than I hear language. But another thing I wanted to quickly say is that it makes me think about the speech to song illusion, Diana Deutsch, where
yeah.
and you hear this in like EDM music all the time, but if you take a clip of a voice that is speaking and you repeat it over and over again, eventually the semantics don't matter because you've heard it already and you hear the melody of that speaking voice.
Yeah, it's so cool. Yeah, I totally recommend people. Uh, I did talk about auditory illusions, I think, in the
Ooh.
last podcast too. But I
Uh-huh.
recommend people look into. Yeah, Diana Deutsch is like she's the founding figure for a lot of those. And she
Mhm.
wrote a great book, called Musical Illusions, I think, something like that.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, there is a really interesting and vague boundary between what is music and what is speech. You can think of spoken word and things that fall kind of in between. And then when we talk, we sort of tune out a lot of the musical aspects of speech. But there's all these cool videos you've probably seen where people are like either harmonizing someone talking or like they're playing drums to it, and the rhythmic or the melodic aspects become really prominent when you do that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I'll write that in. Her name is Anna Deutsch, and I'll have to find the name of the book, but I'll find that in a second. Um, Connie, thank you so much.
Mhm.
We just got a few minutes left, but I was curious. What are some of the unanswered questions about language development or about the inner voice, or what are you most interested in seeing answered in the next
Oh gosh.
decade or so? What are your next
Um,
steps?
well, I think the individual variation is a big one for me because that includes so many things. Like, what is the modality makeup of your mind? How much are you thinking in smells, sounds, textures? But then there's also the like, how much do people vary and how willing they are to have conversations with themselves or to have intrapersonal communication.
Mm.
So I think a lot about we talk about extrovert and introvert, but oh,
Oh,
you know,
uh oh. Okay, that's an evacuation warning for you too, huh?
on that note, yeah,
Dang. All right.
well, that's a fun way to end a podcast. Individual variation. There's so much to explore there.
Oh man. Yeah. Well, uh, it's this has been fun, and man, they were right at the top of the hour almost. I guess we got some stuff to take care of here, but I just wanted to thank you so much, Connie, for joining this. This was awesome. Really fun to talk to you, and it's really valuable to learn about your research and your field. Any last remarks or conclusions you'd like to leave us with? I know that you had a study that you're looking to get some participants for. Um, we could
Yeah, I
add that
have.
somewhere if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. This is not a formal study, so I will say it's not a thing that's gone through any kind of review or anything. It's I wouldn't even call it a study. It's kind of a like, what do you think I should study? But also here's a way I'm trying to do a study. Give me feedback. So if you are interested in that, it's my start at looking at individual differences. Um, but also in general, I'm hoping to build up more dialogue around the idea of intrapersonal communication. So I have a currently very quiet Google group. I guess maybe I could share the link to my lab, my little research group, the Stream of
Yes,
Mind thing,
sure.
because there's some information there where you can find the Google group. And yeah, I want to hear about all of you and your individual differences because I only know what it's like in my mind, and I'm always asking people, tell me what is it like inside of there, so you can be a part of that too.